Hey, and thank you for tuning into the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and joining me this week is Dr. Mary Newport. Mary shares a phenomenal story. She's an amazing woman. Her husband, Steve, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2008, and she used coconut oil and a blend of MCT oil, and she's pretty much one of the first people to figure out the connection between neurodegenerative conditions and a ketogenic diet. So we go into all of that, her thoughts on how to prevent neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, etc., dementia. Just a fantastic conversation with a fantastic woman. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right, and all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet, and if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Mary, thank you for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be on.
Yeah, I was super excited to get you on the show just because Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative conditions in general are something that we haven't had a lot of time to talk about in the show and haven't really featured anybody. And you, I think, are one of the leading experts in this field. So happy to have you on and chat about that.
Oh, thank you.
And so just want to give you, maybe before we dive in, just a little bit about your background as an individual, last 20, 30, 40 years. All the work you've done.
Yeah. Okay. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I went to Xavier University there for pre-med, University of Cincinnati for medical school. And then I did training first in pediatrics and then in newborn intensive care, neonatology. And I did that training in Charleston, South Carolina. And then moved on down to Florida and decided it just wasn't warm enough in South Carolina. And so basically, I have practiced in newborn intensive care units for about 30 years. And then more recently, I've been doing home visits with people who are older who have chronic conditions like diabetes and all the complications that go with that, completely opposite of what I did for 30 years. But the reason I got interested in Alzheimer's and what to do for it, ways to possibly help or prevent it, is because of my husband, Steve. He developed the early onset form of Alzheimer's, and his symptoms started becoming obvious when he was 51. He was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's at 54. And then by 2008, which is kind of when this whole ketone story starts for me. He was really going downhill fast. He was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's and was no longer driving, couldn't use a calculator, turn on a computer, things he had been doing, for years. And it was very disheartening. And so we were looking for clinical trials. And so anyway, that's kind of the beginning of the story there.
And so obviously it's close to home for you. Is that, what did you guys try for treatment when you first figured out that this is the diagnosis?
Well, there aren't any really good treatments for Alzheimer's still. There still aren't. And the only drugs that are out there are things like Aricept and Exelon, which are similar, and another one called Namenda or Memantine. And these aim at trying to increase the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain to try to improve memory. But they have never shown that this improves memory or cognition in people with Alzheimer's. They appear to slow down the disease for about 6 months in about half of the people that take them. And after that, they haven't been able to show any benefit. So that was all we had available. And, there was nothing in the beginning nutritionally that showed up, turn up at all, that I was able to find out, or, doctors certainly weren't talking about that.
So, maybe some people know what the term is, but not understanding sort of the pathophysiology behind it and what causes it. Maybe can you dig in a little bit about, some mechanisms here and what happens in the brain to cause Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so they still don't know exactly what causes it, and billions of dollars of research. But the original Dr. Alzheimer, Alois Alzheimer, back in the early 1900s, he's a pathologist, and he described plaques and tangles, and also abnormal lipid deposits, which have been ignored until just the last couple of years. But plaques and tangles in the brain that in certain people with dementia. And so they started calling this type of dementia Alzheimer's. And there's just been, like I said, billions of dollars of research invested in trying to find drugs to try to remove these plaques, and with the hope that this would improve cognition and cure Alzheimer's disease. And there have been many companies, many different drugs along these lines tried, vaccines and oral medications, and they do remove the plaque, but people don't get better, and they have really serious side effects sometimes. Several of these drugs have been found to actually accelerate Alzheimer's when they're given. So they've all failed. I was just at the Alzheimer's Association conference. I've been going every year the last few years, and it was in July this year. And they had no promising medications on the horizon. And they're starting to talk more and more about lifestyle changes, modifiable lifestyle risks, so that people can work on. And part of that now is nutrition. They ignored that for many years, and just the last few years they've been talking about that and talking more about prevention and trying to cure the disease.
So how did you loop in keto or anything keto related here? And what was that initial spark about? So
it was I call it kind of a perfect storm of everything coming together at the right moment, kind of an accident. Steve was going to try out for 2 new clinical trials for these drugs along the lines of what I was talking about. There hadn't been any for several years in our area, and these 2 came along at the same time. And so I was on the internet the night before he was supposed to be screened for the first trial, and I was looking for risks and benefits of these 2 drugs to help make a decision whether to enter him into one of these, studies, and which one, if he got accepted into both. And I happened on a press release about a medical food that was going to come out about a year later. And they had done 2 pilot studies, one 20 people, another one then 152 people. And they found that nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's that took this medical food had improved memory and cognition. And you never hear that about any Alzheimer's drugs. And they didn't say what it was or how it worked. So I was able to find their patent application. And here was a description of this other pathology of Alzheimer's disease that had almost no awareness that it's a type of diabetes of the brain, that there's insulin resistance, very much like type 2 diabetes, and this results in poor glucose uptake into the areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's. So basically the brain cells aren't getting fuel. And that's, on a typical American Western diet. Well, in Asia, they have a very high carb diet there too. We tend not to be in ketosis. Glucose is a predominant fuel. And this company had come up with the idea of using MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, to help people with Alzheimer's. And the reason that could help is because when you eat medium chain triglycerides, part of that is converted in the liver to ketones, and the rest is distributed in the circulation and is used immediately as fuel by other cells. It turns out MCTs also cross the blood-brain barrier and are used directly by the brain as fuel as well. So in Alzheimer's, so the idea was that ketones are an alternative fuel to glucose. This happens during starvation and fasting normally. Our brain, after prolonged fasting, can use up to 2/3 of its supply of energy as ketones, fuel, I should say, as ketones. And this is just a gradual process. You go from virtually zero over 10 to 20 days up to very high levels of beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, and it becomes a predominant fuel for the brain and the body, muscles, heart, everything. So they had this idea that using MCT could potentially increase ketone levels enough to help somebody with Alzheimer's, help reduce their symptoms. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. This is an interesting idea. As a neonatologist, newborn specialist, I knew what MCT oil was because in the early 80s when I was in training, we used to add it directly to each of the feedings of our tiniest preemies. There were just reports out.
You were adding MCT at that point?
Yes.
I'm sure standard of care right now is maybe canola oil.
No. I'll tell you. Okay. So we would add a little bit to these tiniest preemies, and then the commercial infant formula companies started adding MCT directly to infant formulas, and they are trying to mimic the fatty acid profile in breast milk. And it turns out that coconut oil is the richest natural source of these MCTs, and that virtually there are very few other oils. Palm kernel oil is a close second to coconut oil, but almost none of the other oils that we eat, like canola, soybean, fish oil, olive oil, none of that. They don't have medium chain triglycerides, but coconut oil does. And so if you look on the labels of virtually any infant formula in the world, you will see coconut oil and or palm kernel oil, almost always coconut oil. And then for the premature infants and babies who have trouble absorbing feedings, they also add MCT oil. And they're basically trying to mimic the profile of fatty acids in breast milk. It's breast milk's about 10 to 17% medium chain triglycerides. So I knew what this was. When I read their patent application, I'm like, oh, I used to use MCT oil and it's in the formulas, And so I remembered this, from my medical school, biochemistry, that during starvation, ketones increase and provide fuel to the brain. And I also remembered vaguely that MCT oil is converted to ketones. And I thought, this makes sense to me. This seems to have a sound scientific basis. And so I'm reading about all of this. It's about 1 a.m. and Steve was scheduled at around 9 a.m. for his first screening, so I couldn't really do anything about it. And that turned out to be fortunate because he had a day before and a day and several hours after he started taking coconut oil that we had some testing. And so he needed to qualify for the study. He needed to have a score on this mini mental status exam of 16 out of 30 points. And he only got 14 points that morning. And so he didn't qualify. And we were heartbroken. And his doctor asked him to draw a clock. It's a standard test for Alzheimer's. And he drew like several little circles and several numbers, like 4 numbers, and very random, not organized. And she told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And I thought, given what I read the night before, even though I had been told in medical school that coconut oil was the artery clogging fat, which it turns out isn't true. I thought, we're going to go by a health food store and pick up some coconut oil. And then when we got home, I reminded myself which are the medium chain triglycerides. And then I was able to find the fatty acid composition of coconut oil from the USDA website. There's a food composition website that you can find this out. And it turned out that coconut oil was 60%, that's 60% medium chain triglycerides. And those include C6 through C12. So fatty acids are chains of carbons, and C6 has 6 carbons, C12 has 12. And C12, which is lauric acid, is half of coconut oil, and it has some properties of medium chain fats and some of longer chain fats. But anyway, I use that information to calculate how much coconut oil to give them to try to be equal to the dose of MCT oil that they were using in their clinical trial for the medical food. And they use C8 And so my thinking wasn't quite correct, but it didn't matter because the next morning I gave him, it was a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil for breakfast. And then he was screened 3 hours later for the other clinical trial. And this time he gained 4 points from the day before, which is very significant. Wow. His score went from 14 to 18 out of 30. He remembered things like, even though we were in a different center, so he knew what town we were in, he knew what floor we were on in the facility, what day of the week it was, and he remembered that it was spring. And those were things he couldn't remember the day before. And I thought, okay, well, was this just really good luck? Because it could have been, or was this really the coconut oil? And I thought, well, at any rate, what's the harm in continuing, So I started giving it to him. Actually, right away, increased it. I thought, this medical food is 1 dose a day, and they talked about the level peaking at 90 minutes. So that means it's probably gone after a few hours, right, the ketone levels. So I thought, why not give it to him throughout the day and see if we can keep ketones going to his brain as much as possible. And so I would give him, in the beginning, those first few days, I would give him a little over 2 tablespoons for breakfast, and then started cooking with it. I've got every recipe and coconut cooking book I could get my hands on. The first day, I ordered books, and we went to the bookstore, and I just learned everything I could as quickly as I could about coconut. And then I found books like Coconut Cures and reading about health benefits of coconut oil, and I'm like, maybe they were giving me wrong information in medical school about coconut oil. And my thinking about that too, some people, they won't do it because they're worried about dying of a heart attack from taking coconut oil. And it's like, when you have Alzheimer's, your brain is dying. It is dying. And he was going downhill fast, and I thought the likelihood was much greater that that if he was going to improve, that the coconut oil was going to help him. The benefits were going to far outweigh any risk that he might have a heart attack from taking coconut oil, which I kind of thought was a little bit ludicrous anyway.
And did you guys reduce anything else in his diet, or was it just the addition of coconut oil?
Yeah. So in the beginning, well, he was already on a Mediterranean type diet for about 2 years. And we were on, I would call it.
Did that help at all when you first?
I couldn't really tell. He continued to get worse during that 2 years. So it's really hard to say if it slowed it down. But the reason we were doing that, had been on a convenience food diet like our whole marriage. I mean, a lot of fast food. They don't teach you anything about nutrition in medical school. I had 1 3-hour class in one afternoon on nutrition, which was just appalling when I look back. But, we ate a lot of frozen dinners, and it was, easy for me. I had a tough job, and, it was just easy to cook that way, but to the detriment of our health. And then I had come across an article about Alzheimer's, and it talked about people who were eating the most Mediterranean diet with Alzheimer's lived on average 4 years longer than the people who ate the least Mediterranean-like diet. And I thought, that's really interesting. It hadn't occurred to me that there could be a nutrition connection with Alzheimer's. And so, I read everything I could. I got my hands on so many different kinds of cookbooks, and then decided the Mediterranean diet was a good way to go. So we went from this horrible convenience food diet to a Mediterranean diet. So we were eating whole grains, still eating fruit and all of that, but much less carbohydrate than we were, with the previous diet. And I started losing my fear of fat. We were eating more olive oil and things like that. And but as I said, he continued to get worse. Actually, he got quite a bit worse from 2006 to 2008. Stopped driving, stopped being able to use a computer, couldn't do any more accounting. I mean, he lost all of that, during that 2 years. And so when we started the coconut oil, at first I was just adding it to the diet, and he gained 5 pounds probably pretty quickly over the first month or so. And then he said, I don't really. I mean, he was really pretty with it. I mean, he knew he had Alzheimer's. You could carry on a conversation most of the time, not all the time, but he didn't want to gain weight, and he was just a nice, healthy weight, before we started that. So we started. One thing that happened like almost right away. He had been eating tremendous amounts of fruit every evening. He would eat mangoes and just so much grapes and all this fruit. He would stand at the kitchen sink and eat it. And I thought, looking back, I think that he was craving, sugar. He was craving fuel, for his brain possibly. And that was like the first thing to go. When we started the coconut oil, almost right away he stopped doing that, which was really interesting. And
so he just sort of instinctively stopped eating or craving fruit when he had sort of this high MCT, what do you call it, medical food, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And coconut and MCT oil. And
you think that's just due to the body and the brain having more energy available to it and not needing to refuel?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the brain was getting fuel, and so it didn't have that craving, for that sugar, from the fruit that, he was eating, because that I was, after a week or two, I'm like, geez, he's not eating all that fruit, and so the other thing that happened. Well, so then, I thought, okay, we got to substitute this for other fats in the diet instead of just adding it to his diet. And then the other thing is he just naturally stopped eating as much. He would leave the bread. If he had a sandwich, he'd leave bread, he'd leave pasta, he'd leave rice behind. And I said, okay, I'm just not going to put it on his plate. And, he ended up over about 3 or 4 months, I was giving him both coconut and MCT oil. I would say after about 2 months, I was doing that. And then I started literally mixing them together in the same bottle. I did a 4-to-3 ratio of MCT to coconut oil. And because it was just easier. He could chug it sometimes. We could put it in almost any food because it's liquid at room temperature. So it works in anything hot or cold. And it was just a real easy way to get whole coconut and MCT oil. And the reason I did that was he improved so much just with coconut oil those first couple months that I thought, the thing that happened, I started talking with Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH, who is a world expert on ketones for decades now. He really started intensively working on this in the 1990s and developing his ketone ester back then. And he told me he got really interested in this, and he told me to push the MCT oil and to forget about the coconut oil. And I thought, he improved with just coconut oil. What if there's something else about coconut oil that we don't know yet that could be contributing, to his improvement? And so instead of getting rid of coconut oil, I just started pushing, just the oil, both of the oils together, and always included whole coconut oil in his diet.
Okay. And so when you guys went from, you talked about the 4-point increase in the test the day after you first did it. I mean, when you started loading it up here a couple times a day, what were the benefits that you noticed, or like how did how did symptoms react?
It was really incredible. Now, I've heard from a lot of people, and we call people like Steve a dramatic responder, and some people respond more slowly. But Steve had obvious improvements right away. So the one was the increase in the testing, the improvement, but it was almost like the very next day, it's hard to explain, but in the morning he had been very sluggish. He hardly talked. He couldn't figure out how to just get water from the dispenser in the refrigerator Couldn't figure out how to get a utensil out of the drawer. I mean, he was really slow in the morning, especially, and he would have tremors when he tried to eat. And when he was talking, he would lose track in mid-sentence, and his jaw would tremor. And that all went away really quickly. Within a couple of days, it was obvious. He was moving much faster. He was more talkative. He started whistling again. The animation came back in his face. People with Alzheimer's often have kind of a dead look in their face. He told me that it felt like a light switch came on in his brain the day he started the coconut oil. So those were some things we saw like right away. The tremors, that was really amazing. And this happens, people with Parkinson's usually have tremors. And the tremors just went away really quickly. And this is people with Parkinson's experience the same thing. They take coconut oil and a half hour later, their tremor's gone. This happens with a lot of people with Parkinson's. So, I learned all of this later about other people, but for Steve, that was one physical symptom that improved right away. And then over the clock drawing, at 2 weeks after he started the coconut oil, he drew another clock. He was still trying to get into clinical trials, but he drew another clock. And this time it was the whole circle. He had all the numbers arranged in the right order. I think he had duplicated one number, and then he had a bazillion hands on the clock. There were a lot of hands on the clock. So it was really messy, but it was organized. It was much better than 2 weeks earlier. And at 37 days, it was even better than that. And then the other thing, he had a stiff, kind of slow gait. He would kind of pick his feet up kind of weird, and he couldn't run anymore. And around 2 months, he started walking normally and started being able to tie his shoes again, which he hadn't been able to do for a while. And around 3 or 4 months, he was able to read again. And he had stopped reading for about 1.5 years at that point. And he was somebody who read novels all the time. He was constantly reading Clive Cussler and other books like that. And he explained to me that he had not been able to read because the words would shake on the page. It was like, he said, that was like they were like in pixels, like when your satellite TV breaks up and, they would shake on the page, and he couldn't focus really on reading. And somewhere around 3 to 4 months, that completely stopped, and it never started up again. And then his reading comprehension started improving, and he started remembering what he had read earlier at around 9 or 10 months. So he had a gradual improvement over that year, and he improved so much during that first year that he was able to start volunteering at the hospital where I worked at in the warehouse, helping deliver supplies and putting stickers on supplies and things like that. So that made him joyous, that he could do some kind of work again.
So pretty dramatic then.
Yeah, very dramatic, and some of it immediate, and other things, more appeared more gradually over time. And
did you guys find that there was a lot of diminishing returns with after 4 tablespoons a day, it really didn't have any effect, or did you find sort of an upper limit?
We ended up leveling off at about 9 or 10 tablespoons a day. Sometimes he'd get a little bit more than that. And, he ended up getting it 4 times a day. Originally it was twice a day, and then measured doses, and then added the third, and then finally at bedtime. And we had to work up gradually. He tolerated it very well in the beginning, but when you push it to a certain point with MCT oil, you tend to get diarrhea. Mm-hmm. It's very common. Some people can't even take a teaspoon of it without getting diarrhea the first time. So I tell people to go very slowly. And it took about maybe 4 months to get up to that amount. And I just felt like, I was talking with Dr. Veach, and the ketone ester that he had developed, you can get levels 10 times higher easily than what you can get with MCT oil. And he felt like we needed the highest levels possible to maximize, his improvement. And at that point, it wasn't possible for him to get the ketone ester. So they hadn't done toxicity studies. They were in progress at that point. So, I just felt like, if you mix coconut and MCT oil, that you should have a steady stream of ketones pretty much 24/7. We found Dr. Veach actually tested his ketone levels, and they didn't have the fancy little home ketone meters at that point. And so we sent his levels to the NIH, and we did it one day where you got 2 doses of coconut oil, breakfast and dinner. And then a couple weeks later, he had just a dose of MCT oil in the morning, just one dose. And we did see that his MCT level peaked at 90 minutes, and it was higher. The peak level was higher than what we saw with the coconut oil. But the ketones were back to baseline after 3 hours, just 3 hours after the dose. And then with the coconut oil, it took 3 hours for it to peak, and the levels were lower. But then when we measured 6 hours later, there was still a little bit of ketone on board.
Interesting. So you were spot on with combining the two then.
Yeah. So that's really why I did. I thought, knowing a little bit about pharmacokinetics and how medications work, if you combine two things like that, it should smooth out the curve instead of the level going up and down as it would with MCT oil, that it should have a smoother curve, where it doesn't, stays more steady and doesn't fluctuate drastically.
So it was a combination then of coconut and MCT sort of what you guys ended on, or did you start experimenting with other ketogenic compounds or diet or fasting or anything like that?
Well, I feel that given the amount of fat he had in the diet and that he had cut out so much carbs that he probably was on a pretty good ketogenic diet. We just didn't have a way to measure it, at that point in 2008, other than possibly sending levels to Dr. Veach. But looking back, I feel that he probably was on a ketogenic diet. The other things weren't out yet. Ketone salts didn't come out till 2016, and the ketone ester just became available in early 2018. So Steve, he improved a lot that first year, and then he leveled off for another year. But he was still, he was much more active. He could cut the grass again, and a lot of things he could do again that he wasn't able to do, for a while there. And he actually did qualify for both of those clinical trials. And so we got to choose. And 2 months after we started the coconut oil, I told them what we were doing and how it responded, and they said they couldn't imagine how a food could possibly screw up their results, so they admitted him to this. He was accepted to both studies. He had to choose one, and we chose this oral medication, and then we found out later that he had been on the placebo for 12 to 14 months. So, at that first year, I wasn't, I knew he had improved a lot that first 2 months before he entered the study. But after that, I wasn't sure if we were just lucky and he got this great medication that was going to cure Alzheimer's, or if it was the coconut oil. But it was the coconut oil and MCT oil, because he was on the placebo, so the drug had nothing to do with it.
So he was a confounding variable. He was messing up the study results.
Yes, he was. And
great.
We found out later, that first year, there's a test called the Alzheimer's Disease Assessment Scale, and that they use for a lot of this research. And he gained 6 points on that out of 75 points. The first year, the other people on placebo, when they reported the study, lost 6 points on average. So, that was good. And then another test called Activities of Daily Living. This is just how you function on a day-to-day basis. Can you, take a shower yourself? Can you get yourself something to eat? Basics like that. And he gained 14. He improved by 14 out of 78 points on that one, which is very significant during that first year. So, we just saw, and I could see that. And he would just say, I can do things easier. Because, with Alzheimer's, it's the strangest thing. Over time, people, lose the ability to just do step by step on the most basic things, like taking a shower. You would have to, tell them, okay, now put the shampoo in your hair. Okay, now rub it in. Okay, rinse it off. Step by step by step. It's just awful. And, he could do more automatically. He could do things like that. Just do them again, instead of having to be talked through, so many things. And so, it was really quite extraordinary. And, I became overwhelmed, when this happened, probably about 2 weeks into it. I thought, geez, we had looked at each other after 4 or 5 days and said, this is really doing something. Our life has changed for the better. And I felt like I had this really big secret, that I had to tell, there's something like 35 million people in the world with Alzheimer's, that I had to get this message out. And I became really quite overwhelmed by it. And, I started writing. I started writing to first Sandra Day O'Connor, whose husband had Alzheimer's at that time, and she was on an Alzheimer's study group. I wrote to the Alzheimer's Association. I wrote to politicians. I wrote to media, and basically, I was telling them, look, there's this medical food that's going to come out in a year. But it's available on the shelf now as coconut oil and MCT oil. You can get it on the shelf now. You could even get C8, which was the MCT oil that was in, their medical food. You could get it from, one of the fitness website. They carried it at that time. And I just thought to me, it was criminal, that, and I was angry, that I didn't know about this 4 years sooner, before he had declined so much. That was when they published their first pilot study, but it was in a very esoteric journal that, most doctors would never even know about, much less read. And so I felt like they should have been broadcasting this, that this is something on the shelf that could help people, and, go ahead with the medical food, and, it's it would be a prescription, but those kind of things take years for doctors to learn about and to start prescribing. And, I just felt like everybody should get to know about this and have a choice if they want to try it or not.
And sort of like you were pointing out before, I mean, what is the risk? If you're at this point already, it's even if, which again, I think we both agree that coconut oil does not cause heart disease, but that is a very long process, even if that were the case, which is likely not to occur.
Yeah.
At that age in life, if you started eating coconut oil at that point. So the fact that it's broadly commercially available and there's no risk, sort of a why not type of thing.
Exactly. And that's what I would say all the time. What do you have to lose? So I wrote an article. This was 2 months after the Alzheimer's Association was having a conference in Chicago, and they usually have at least 5,000 researchers and doctors from all around the world that attend this, and a big exhibit hall. And so I wrote an article about what happened with Steve as a case study of this, using medium chain triglycerides to increase ketones, to help somebody with Alzheimer's, and mentioned the medical food that was going to come out in a year and all of this. And I submitted this little case report to them, and I requested a table to distribute it in their exhibit hall, and they said yes. They said yes, and so I made arrangements. My sister and her husband were going to join us and help with the booth, and I was going to attend the conference, and they would look after Steve and distribute this. And I had 1,500 copies printed up, and then 3 days before, they contacted me, and they had changed their minds.
Why?
They didn't really tell me why. They had just, rescinded the offer. They did refund my money. I had already paid for the table and everything. They had reviewed the article. I sent it to them, before they approved it originally. And I argued with them. I went back and forth. This is just a food, people need to know about it. They can decide for themselves, if they want to do this or not, and it
had to be so frustrating.
Yeah, it was I was furious. And, I argued with them that they're supposed to be advocates, for people with Alzheimer's. And this makes sense, logically, and like when I wrote to all of those people, I would tell them, look, I know Steve is just one person, but there were 152 other people in this other study, and half of them improved. And if Steve improved and they improved, other people would improve. Why should they have to wait another year for a medical food? That was my point, and that they needed to study this intensively. And Dr. Veach's ketone ester, he needed funding. He wasn't able to get funding from the NIH to mass produce it and study it for Alzheimer's disease. And, so that was my whole point.
So what was this, like 2009, 2010, or what?
This was 2008 still.
Oh, wow.
So this was like 2 months. This was June of 2008, July, 2 months after he started the coconut oil. And one thing that the medical food company did have an exhibit there. and so I had a feeling maybe that interfered with me getting to have the table, that they didn't like that I was there telling people to just go out and get coconut and MCT oil, so that may have been the problem. But they just weren't really upfront, as to why they had rescinded it. They told me, well, first they said, you have to be a corporation. I said, oh, okay, I'm a doctor. I have a corporation. We'll just put it through that. And then they said, oh, well, you have to be selling something. And I'm like, and I was going to pass out a free article. I said, well, I could charge $1 for the article. And then I told them, they had like Audible books there. They had travel exhibits. It's like, come on,
Right.
But they wouldn't. They told me I could come to the conference, but I couldn't pass out my article or much less have a table. And I did go. We went. And I had all those 1,500 printed up there already, and so we distributed them at health food stores there. And I went to the conference. I looked at. They have over 2,000 posters at this conference every year. They have like 500 a day. Now it's 600 a day. And so I looked for any physician or PhD that had a poster about nutrition, about insulin, glucose, anything nutrition related, and I would stop and talk to them and tell them about ketones. My goal was to try to get them interested in studying this, and then I'd hand them my case study, even though I wasn't supposed to. I slipped it, to them, and like here, and
little guerrilla marketing there. It's perfect.
Yes. And so then, because 5,000 researchers, I thought this could get out to all around the world, that for people to know about this and be able to try it. And so I came home and then just took the grassroots approach, and my family helped a lot with this, putting it out on the internet, and I would take copies to, health food stores because I had so many copies. And then one of them got interested and they invited me to come and give a talk. And then another one had me talk. And then the hospital I worked at had me give a talk. And they had about 90 people that showed up for that. And then our regional newspaper picked up on it, and they did a story, and they interviewed Dr. Veach, and they interviewed Dr. Theodore Van Italy, who was one of the doctors who discovered that MCT oils converted the ketones back in the 1960s. And so it was it was a good article, and it really got out there. They had a picture of Steve and I with his 3 clocks, the before and then at 2 weeks and then at 37 days. And that was what hit home with everybody. They're like, oh my God, this is a big deal. You can see the clocks on my website and in my books. So then after that, I started hearing back, then from other people who were trying this. And the next person that I heard from was in the fall of 2008. Well, actually, it was around January 2009, and her mother had started taking coconut oil right around Thanksgiving of 2008, and she was a lady with Alzheimer's. She was in bed. She was barely talking. She didn't recognize them. She was barely eating. And over about 2 months, her daughter said what didn't happen right away. It took about 2 months. She slowly started getting up out of bed again, eating again, started recognizing them. And then one day she was walking around and she gets in the refrigerator, and they're like, thought she was getting into trouble. And she said, I'm just looking for that Pepperidge Farm cake that you bought yesterday. And they had bought a Pepperidge Farm cake yesterday. And then she started reading the newspaper and after 6 months, she was knitting again. It's like, oh my God, the lady kept in touch with me for several years, and her mother died at 83 with pneumonia, with an infection, but she recognized her family, and she was up and about, didn't die from Alzheimer's. She died from another disease of old age. So,
and is that pretty common then with what you've seen since then?
Yeah.
That, it's just sort of the symptoms go away, and then it's just sort of old age takes over?
Yeah, I've seen that quite a bit. And if the neurons are dead, you're not going to recover that part. Like Steve didn't fully recover. He would have loved to go back to work and make a living as an accountant, but he tried to get his computer skills back. But he figured out again how to use a mouse, how to turn on the computer, but he couldn't get too much further than that,
Okay.
So when you learn a certain amount, lose a certain amount of neurons, you're not going to get those pathways back, I guess. But it was quite remarkable, and I've collected probably over 500 like emails, little reports from people, and I don't prompt them. I don't say, "Did you see this? Did you see that?" I just have them tell me what changes they saw, and it's pretty dramatic. And I think they're much more likely to write to me if they see some improvement. But I did have some people say they saw absolutely no changes. But I had, about 90% of the people that responded, reported to me, emailed me, were reporting some kind of positive response. And sometimes it was slow, and other times it was pretty dramatic, like Steve. And, when people get more functional and they interact with their grandchildren again, and, they can do activities again. And, some people even have written books about, what happened with their parent while they were taking coconut oil. It's really interesting.
So you first started doing this 2008, 2019. What has changed in that time? What are the major developments?
Well, the major developments, I would say, are the biggest one is coming out with these exogenous ketone supplements. So, Dr. Veach had been working on his since around, I want to say 1996 or so, and trying to get the right formulation and everything, but, just trying to get it produced. Dr. Dominic D'Agostino here, are you familiar with him? Mm-hmm. At University of South Florida here in Tampa. So he saw that article about Steve and I in our regional newspaper, and then we were attending a research update at the Bird Alzheimer Institute, and he recognized us and came up to us and struck up a conversation. And then he told me about what he had been doing with the Navy SEALs, and that trying to protect them from seizures when they dive with 100% oxygen. After 10 or 15 minutes, they can have a seizure. So he was looking at the ketogenic diet as a way to potentially protect the brain. And then when he read this article in the paper and saw the interview with Dr. Veach about the ketone ester, that was his first awareness that a ketone ester existed, that this might be a possibility to use with the Navy SEALs. So he got very interested in this. And then he began studying every ketogenic substance like butanediol, which is part of Dr. Veach's ketone ester. Butanediol converts to beta-hydroxybutyrate in the liver. So Dr. Veach's idea was to combine beta-hydroxybutyrate with butanediol, which could give a longer lasting effect of increasing the ketone, beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then he started experimenting with ketone salts and working on those and developing those. So Steve, after 2 years, he started to decline. He had a downturn, and what happened, and I think this is what happened with Steve. So he was on the placebo for that clinical trial for about 12 to 14 months. Then he got actually crossed over to the drug, and he was on it for about 5 to 7 months. And then he started having all kinds of weird side effects. He had abrasions that wouldn't heal. He would nick himself shaving, and it would bleed for a few days. And he fainted, and his CPK, it's a cardiac enzyme, went way up. It could be a muscle enzyme. It turned out it was probably from muscle. But I got really nervous and pulled him out of the study. And then we got a call a few months later that they had completely stopped the study because this drug caused accelerated worsening of Alzheimer's. And Steve, to me, the irony was that he improved so much with coconut oil that he got into the study only to be on a drug that accelerated Alzheimer's, the last 5 or 6 months. And that was right about the time when he started kind of going downhill again. So Dr. Veach, we had stayed in really close contact, and he said, toxicity testing has been completed. It looks really good. The profile, the FDA had recognized it as grass, generally recognized as safe for healthy adults for 5 days, something like that. So he said, asked if we would want to be a clinical trial of one person for Steve. And of course we said yes. I mean, to me, it just blew me away that Steve could be the first person with Alzheimer's in the world that I know of, to take a ketone ester. And so he sent it to us, and it tasted horrible. It just tasted really bad, like jet fuel, And so I had to try to be creative and try to find ways to make it palatable for him to drink it. I mean, these days they have really done tremendous work on improving the taste of it. But the very first dose that Steve took, it was like the light bulb, brightened up again, and he could. He had not been able to say or write out the alphabet for several months at that point. And it took him about 20 minutes, and just that he could try and at it, stay at it for 20 minutes over and over and over and over. And he finally said the whole alphabet, and he wrote out the whole alphabet, and he was so happy. And then, some of the things he had lost, and it was, back to having to be instructed step by step, for a shower and shaving and dressing and everything. He needed help with every little thing like that. 24 hours later, he was back to, he could just do it again. And, just turn him right around. And, we kind of experimented with dosing, and by then they did have ketone meters available, so I was able to check his ketone levels to see what kind of dose would be appropriate. And we found with Steve somewhere between 25 and 35 grams per dose would get his ketone level in the 4 to 5 range, which is what Dr. Veach wanted us to aim for, 4 to 5 millimoles, which was quite high. Like with MCT oil, if you eat a lot of it, you might get between 0.5 and 1 millimole levels. But this was quite a bit higher, and we did see a dramatic improvement, and kept the MCT and coconut oil going. I didn't want to stop it. Dr. Veach wished I would have stopped it, but I was just reluctant to do it. I just didn't want to risk that he would lose ground and we wouldn't get him back. So I kept that going too. We kept his really healthy diet going, and he improved a lot over 6 weeks, got back to doing activities again, like cutting the grass, and he was very stable for another 20 months, before he had his next setback. So we did write that up as a case report. First, his response to the medium chain triglycerides, the coconut and MCT oil, and then his response to the ketone ester, and what his levels were. We published all of that, but he was just much happier again. Mood much better, and it was we were just very grateful to Dr. Veach, that he got to be this clinical trial of one person, and it took a long time to get it published. We had to, it was back and forth with reviewers, and but finally it did get published. Dr. Veach didn't think that was going to happen, but it did. And in Alzheimer's and Dementia, it's in that particular journal, which is very well read by Alzheimer researchers and doctors, all around the world. So, but I think the most exciting things to me now is that you can take beta-hydroxybutyrate as a supplement and get your ketone levels up, be it with ketone salts or, even higher levels with ketone esters. And right. The main thing is they're pretty expensive. The ketone ester especially is still quite expensive. But it is getting out to other people with Alzheimer's. I follow a number of them who are taking it, and they're finding that they don't need the dose that's recommended on the bottle for elite athletes, who are right. trying to improve their athletic performance. Even though Steve was taking that amount, he was taking, that kind of a dose. Usually he was getting 25 grams 3 times a day, which is quite a lot. But with the people with Alzheimer's, we're finding that some of them respond to 5 or 10 grams a day of beta-hydroxybutyrate, that they'll have a significant improvement. And the other interesting thing about ketones, too, and I think that this might have been a factor of how Steve continued to improve, over a year, is that ketones are anti-inflammatory. They enter these metabolic pathways that reduce inflammation kind of directly, and also by reducing reactive oxygen species and acting as antioxidants and acting as scavengers of these reactive oxygen species that cause so much damage. So they're anti-inflammatory, and inflammation is at the root. It's a very prominent feature of Alzheimer's. You don't have Alzheimer's unless there's inflammation in the brain. And this is true of many neurodegenerative diseases and autism and diabetes. People with diabetes have a lot of inflammation in their body from the chronically high sugar levels, and arthritis and lung diseases. I mean, so many diseases have inflammation. I think the beauty of these being able to use beta hydroxybutyrate directly is that it can also help, reduce inflammation. And that's something that I think happens over time. So some of the people that are taking it, the ketone ester, in the beginning, they may not see a dramatic change, as Steve did, but they're using smaller doses. But over 2 or 3 months, they're like, oh, okay, he's doing much better than he has for a couple years. That's the kind of reports that I've been getting. So, just an interesting phenomenon, and I'm not surprised because I saw it, firsthand. But
so would you say that now you maybe have seen with a lot of other people that have been using this to create sort of like a standardized protocol at all of, once you start noticing symptoms, this is what you do, here are the different modifications you can do, or what have you noticed there?
Yeah. Okay. So I do think, people do tend to develop it. I think it's a little bit individualized, but one thing is to think of it for prevention, So when Steve started taking it, I started taking it then,
I was going to ask you,
every day
since. Is it something that people, if they have, family history, especially, and worries about it, that it's something they could do preventatively?
Yeah. And the reasons are that this problem with glucose uptake, when they look at people who are at risk because of their family history, they see already decreased glucose uptake 10 and 20 years before they develop symptoms. And they've even documented this in 20-year-olds who are at risk because of their family history, that they already have decreased glucose uptake in the brain. Dr. Stephen Cunnane has done a ton of work. He's at Sherbrooke University in Canada, and he's been doing ketone and glucose PET scans, and he has studied healthy young adults, healthy older adults, people with mild cognitive impairment that can lead to Alzheimer's, and people with Alzheimer's. And he has found that cognitively normal older adults have a gap. He calls it the brain energy gap, a gap of about 7% between how much energy the brain needs and how much it actually gets. And you probably know that the brain starts shrinking just a tiny bit every year when you're kind of in your late 30s. And then you get this gap, and your brain just not getting enough energy. And he's been able to show that MCT oil can fill in the gap, the energy gap, with these ketone PET scans. And he's in somebody who is still healthy, not having memory problems, this could be maybe 2 tablespoons a day of MCT oil. So he's studying the standard MCT oil that's the 60-40 mixture of C8 and C10. When he does these studies, he found C8, too many people have diarrhea with it. So he decided to use the standard, MCT oil there. He's also been able to show that the Alzheimer brain takes ketones normally. Those same areas that are affected with decreased glucose uptake take ketones up normally. So there are still neurons there. That those areas of the brain aren't dead. They may have lost neurons, but there are still plenty of neurons there, enough to take up ketones normally, which is really interesting. So amazingly, after ignoring me for years, the Alzheimer's Association has come around. They've had kind of a change at the top there and coming around to prevention and recognizing that nutrition could be important. And they have been funding Dr. Cunnane's studies with the MCT oil. And first he did a study, it was a 1-month study, kind of a proof of concept in people with mild cognitive impairment. And he was able to show that MCT oil does, in fact, increase ketone uptake in the brain. And now he just published I believe it was in Alzheimer's and Dementia. It might have been Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia. But he published the first half of his study of people with mild cognitive impairment, and they were taking 15 mLs or 1 tablespoon twice a day, so 2 tablespoons a day of MCT oil for 6 months. And they did, the ketone and glucose PET scans before and at the end of the 6 months. And then they also did cognitive testing. And at the end of 6 months, they did document this increase in energy to the brain as, by way of ketones, and a number of cognitive and memory tests that these people improved over 6 months. And Cunnane strongly believes that that this could be used for prevention. And so now they're doing the second half of their study. They increase it to 45 mLs because he's been able to show with the ketone PET scan that the higher your ketone level is, the greater the percentage of energy that is provided to your brain by ketones. So the next step then, he's gotten funding now from the Alzheimer's Association. So once he completes this MCT oil study, he's going to do a study of the ketone ester. So this will be the first ever study and it's Dr. Veach's ketone ester in people with mild cognitive impairment to see what kind of hopefully improvement and to be able to prove, that, how much energy is contributed to the brain in the form of ketones. Right. Ester. So pretty exciting. And, with the Alzheimer's Association funding it. And 2 years ago in 2017, they had the first ever session about ketones. Dr. Cunnane headed it up, and there was an MCT oil ketogenic diet study. It was a pilot study presented by Dr. Russell Swerdlow, who is now doing an 80-person larger study over a longer duration of time with it's the MCT oil modified ketogenic diet. And then there are some other, Dr. Suzanne Kraft is doing a ketogenic diet, but she's not using coconut or MCT oil. And hers, I think she hasn't quite come around to that yet. But anyway, so there are kind of exciting things on the horizon there and in progress. And I'm just thrilled.
So you mentioned a lot about Alzheimer's specifically. Does this apply, have you seen, to a lot of other neurodegenerative conditions? Like you mentioned Parkinson's as well. Is it pretty much anything where the brain has lack of energy that you're seeing these positive results?
Yeah, a lack of, and these are mostly anecdotal, they need to have studies, but I've probably personally heard from about 45 or 50 people with Parkinson's that have had improvement. There's a man, Bill Curtis, Curtis, and he's got a couple videos on YouTube, and I've gotten to know him. He's actually helping Dr. Veach. He goes in, but he's in my book, my most recent book that I wrote, the complete book of ketones. He's one of the 16 people that I interviewed, and he's in his late 50s, and he had to stop working. He was a computer techie guy, and he couldn't even get out of a chair by himself. He needed help to get out of a chair. He was so stiff and having so much tremor and brain fog, that he couldn't work anymore. And he read, his father had told him about the ketogenic diet for Parkinson's. There was a 5-person study that people had 40-something% improvement in their symptoms. And so he knew about that, but he hadn't done anything about it. And then he started reading about Dr. Veach's ketone ester and about coconut oil and all of this. So first he started doing bulletproof coffee when it was coconut oil. It used to be coconut oil, and now it's MCT oil. And he would put butter and coconut oil into his coffee, and he could function much better. His tremor, and there's a video of him playing the guitar before and after he got his bulletproof coffee on YouTube. So if you look Bill Curtis and Parkinson's, it'll pop up. And then there's a second video of him, and this was after he connected with Dr. Veach, and he did a clinical a little, like a 10-day trial with the ketone ester, and it was dramatic. He has footage from, there's one day it's the same time of the morning when he did not get the ketone ester. And he's got, you can just see marked tremor. He has trouble walking, getting up and down from his chair. And then the next day, he takes the ketone ester. This is at the same time in the morning, I think 8:30 in the morning. No tremor at all. He gets up, he just walks in one way, walks the other, and it's really quite dramatic. And but that's the kind of thing, people with Parkinson's report. And I've had several people with Parkinson's that have stayed in touch with me for years, and they felt like they improved and that they haven't really gotten much, if at all, worse, over that period of time. And so, it's exciting for that. And then, some other disorders are like multiple sclerosis. That's one that has decreased glucose uptake into nerve cells. And coconut oil, there's some evidence out there that it can help with remyelination. So they lose the myelin insulation on nerves in MS, but they also have trouble, getting fuel, getting ATP in the cells. So ketones can help with that, and coconut oil may help. Also, with that, people with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, there's a Deanna protocol out there, and they're using coconut oil to eat, and they massage with it. They use alpha-ketoglutarate, which is in the same TCA cycle that ketones enter. It's downstream from that. And they use some other supplements to try to improve energy production in the mitochondria. And children, for example, with autism respond to the ketogenic diet. And I, had personally have gotten reports, from families, children with autism, they may stop, having less seizures, they're growing better, functioning better in school, this kind of thing. So I've gotten all kinds of crazy reports, and people with Alzheimer's that were so advanced. Like people say, does it, what if somebody's in very late stages, could it help them? And so I've had several people now that they had not been talking for a year or longer that started talking again, within like hours to a day of starting coconut oil.
And are a lot of these findings that you're talking about, are they coming from just the addition of MCT or ketones, or is it like full ketogenic diet plus this?
No, these are usually just adding it. Sometimes it's not even that much coconut oil yet, or MCT oil.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question I get all the time personally, which is, is it bad to have ketones and carbohydrates in your bloodstream at any given time because your body is not used to that? It's not normal. It's not natural. And I think that you're finding quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. And I think, looking back at our ancestors, it's only this last 50 or 60 years, that we are eating so much carbohydrate, and we've been told to eat a low-fat diet, I mean, our ancestors ate a higher fat diet. They had, they ate lard, and that's what they cooked with. Chicken fat and lard and, beef tallow. I mean, that's how they ate. And, all this carbohydrate and artificial foods and chemicals and trans fats and all this are all new to us. And, I think that this has everything to do with the epidemics, obesity, diabetes, and dementia. If you're diabetic, you have a 30% chance of developing dementia. It's a really high possibility. And, so I think we've just really gone astray, and that our ancestors, until, maybe this last 50 to 100 years, that they probably were in ketosis a good bit of the time, because of the way they were eating and the amount of exercise they got. There's actually a phenomenon called post-exercise ketosis, where if you do some vigorous exercise for 30 to 45 minutes, your ketone levels will go up, and they'll stay up for hours afterwards. And it's a small bump. I mean, it's not a huge increase in ketones, but it does increase. And but if you eat they found doing this research back like in the mid 1900s that if you eat a carbohydrate meal before you exercise, you don't go into ketosis.
Which is what everybody thinks that they need. Well, Mary, thank you so much for time
you're
today.
Welcome.
I mean, you I think pioneered a lot of this stuff 2008 when you started pushing it out. So thank you for not taking no for an answer. I know there was a lot of setbacks along the way. But probably wouldn't be where we're at without a lot of your help. So appreciate that. And you mentioned one of your books before, The Complete Book of Ketones. We have a few copies rolling around the office at any given time. Where can people find that, and what is that about?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the complete book of ketones, that's my third book. The first one was Alzheimer's disease, What If There Was a Cure? The Story of Ketones. And then my second one was the coconut oil and low-carb solution for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other diseases. And then I decided to kind of broaden the approach. And this book, the complete book of ketones, is it's a review of the history of ketogenic diets. I interviewed 16 people. Many of them, most of them were ketone researchers. I wanted people to know this is real serious research that's going on. So my oldest interviewee was Dr. Theodore Van Italy, who is 99. He's about to turn 100 years old, and he's still actively publishing. He wrote the foreword to my book.
Must be the ketones.
Yes, yeah. And his partner, Dr. Sammy Hashem, is 88. Dr. Richard Veach is 84. I interviewed all of them. And then Dr. Cunane, Dr. Russell Swerdlow, and then the up-and-coming, Dominic's probably more than just up-and-coming now, the new stars in ketone research. He, Angela Poff, Dr. Tom Seyfried, who studies ketogenic diet for cancer, several clinicians who are using it, and dietitians who are teaching people a ketogenic diet, and then a couple of people, one man with Alzheimer's. I've actually gotten to meet him finally, but started doing better with coconut oil and MCT oil in 2012, and then added ketone salts about 3 years ago, and just recently also added ketone ester to the regimen, and he's doing better than he has for years, and he's been downgraded. He's the first person I heard of where the neurologist decided he had Alzheimer's in 2012, and now they say he has mild cognitive impairment, which is what happens before Alzheimer's.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And I met him, and he carried on a perfectly normal conversation. It was just, you wouldn't guess that he had, Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. So, so my book's about that and the science, and then how to put the diet together. It's got very practical points for, how to basically clean up your diet first to get ready for the ketogenic diet, and then how to actually calculate it. A lot of recipes in there, and questions and answers about and discussion of the ketone salts, the ketone esters, exercise, fasting overnight and intermittent fasting, and how all of those can contribute to increasing ketone levels. So it's full of information. It took a long time to write, and it's available on, it's in Barnes & Noble, in Books A Million, and it's on all of their websites. It's on Amazon. Amazon probably has the best price for it. There are ebooks available, and it's I'm just really excited that it's out there, and I hope people, get a lot of good information from it.
Well, thank you, Mary, so much for your work.
Oh, you're welcome. Oh, just one thing. I do have a website with a whole lot of information, articles I've written, scientific articles, full-length articles by Dr. Veach and other people. CoconutKetones.com. So it's coconut, KETONES.com.
Perfect.
And a lot of information there.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.